I stood in the break room holding my termination badge, hands shaking like leaves in a storm. Frank Donovan leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, that smirk plastered across his face. He had just told me I was demoted from compliance director to unpaid intern after 7 years of building the entire compliance infrastructure at DataCore Systems. When I refused and handed back my badge, he laughed and said no credible company would touch me now because he would make sure of it. I walked out knowing my career might be over, but I would not stay silent about what I discovered. 3 weeks before that humiliating moment in the break room, I sat at my desk on the 14th floor of DataCore Systems in Austin, Texas, reviewing our quarterly compliance audits. The spring sunshine streamed through my corner office windows, and I remember thinking how lucky I was. I had spent 7 years building something I was genuinely proud of. When I started at DataCore as their first dedicated compliance professional, we were a scrappy startup with maybe 30 employees and big dreams. Now we had 215 people across 3 offices, and our healthcare data management software served hospitals and clinics in 42 states. I had single-handedly constructed our entire compliance framework from the ground up. Every policy, every training module, every monitoring system bore my fingerprints. We held certifications that made venture capitalists take notice. Our HIPAA compliance program was considered one of the best in the industry for a company our size. I earned $95,000 annually with excellent benefits, and my professional reputation in the compliance community was solid. People asked me to speak at conferences. Colleagues from other companies reached out for advice. I had arrived, or so I thought. That particular Tuesday morning started like any other. I was reviewing our quarterly audit of client data handling procedures, something I did 4 times a year without fail. I clicked through access logs, checked encryption protocols, verified that patient healthcare information was being stored and transmitted according to our policies and federal regulations. Everything should have been routine. But then I noticed something odd in the API call logs. There were data requests happening at unusual times, 2 and 3 in the morning, accessing patient records in batches of 500 at a time. The requests were coming from IP addresses I did not recognize. My stomach tightened. I dug deeper, pulling up server logs that most people at the company never looked at. What I found made my blood run cold. Patient healthcare data was being routed to offshore servers in locations not listed anywhere in our client contracts. The servers were in countries with minimal data protection laws. Worse, the routing had been happening for at least 8 months, maybe longer. I traced the authorization trail and found that back-end system changes had been personally approved by Frank Donovan, my boss, and the vice president of operations. I spent the next 2 days documenting everything. I created encrypted spreadsheets showing the unauthorized data flows, took screenshots of the server configurations, copied the email chains where Frank approved the changes, and documented every single HIPAA violation I could identify. There were dozens. Any one of them could result in fines of $50,000 or more. Collectively, we were looking at potential penalties in the millions, possibly tens of millions. Beyond the money, there could be criminal charges if the Department of Health and Human Services determined the violations were willful. Patient data had been compromised. People's private medical information was sitting on servers in jurisdictions where it could be accessed, sold, or stolen without consequence. I backed up all my documentation on 3 separate personal devices. I was meticulous because I knew this was serious. This was not a minor paperwork error or a technical oversight. This was deliberate. Someone had intentionally routed patient data to unauthorized locations and hidden it from our compliance monitoring. I kept asking myself why. What possible reason could justify this risk? On Thursday afternoon, I requested a private meeting with Frank. We met in his office, a space twice the size of mine, with a view of the downtown skyline. Frank was in his early 50s, silver hair always perfectly styled, expensive suits, confident handshake. He had come up through sales and operations, not compliance or legal. He understood business deals and profit margins, not regulatory frameworks, but he was smart, charismatic, and well-connected throughout the Austin tech scene. I had always respected him, even if we occasionally disagreed on priorities. I sat across from his desk and pulled up my documentation on my laptop. I kept my tone professional and factual. I showed him the data routing patterns, explained the HIPAA violations, walked him through the potential consequences. I expected concern. I expected him to be alarmed that we had a serious problem requiring immediate remediation. I expected him to ask what we needed to do to fix it. Instead, Frank was eerily calm. He barely glanced at my screen. He leaned back in his leather chair, fingers steepled, and said the offshore routing was necessary for efficiency. He said I was overthinking regulatory minutiae. He used the phrase regulatory minutiae like it was something trivial, something that did not matter. I explained that HIPAA was federal law, not a suggestion. I explained that our clients trusted us with their patients' most sensitive information. I explained that if this came to light, it would destroy the company and potentially land people in prison. Frank's expression did not change. He said the company was in the middle of acquisition talks worth $30 million. He said a major healthcare technology company was conducting due diligence right now. He said nothing could jeopardize that deal. Nothing. He told me the quarterly compliance report needed to be submitted to our board of directors by the following Monday, and it needed to be clean. No red flags. No concerns. Just a standard certification that all systems were compliant. I felt like I had been punched. I told him I could not sign off on a false report. I could not certify that we were compliant when we clearly were not. He asked if I understood how much was at stake. I said I understood perfectly, which was exactly why we needed to self-report the violations to federal regulators immediately. Self-reporting showed good faith. It could reduce penalties. Waiting would make everything worse. Frank stood up. The meeting was over. He said I had 48 hours to sign the clean compliance report or face consequences. The way he said consequences made my skin crawl. I asked what he meant. He just smiled and said, I was a smart woman. I would figure it out. I left his office feeling sick. I thought he meant he would fire me. I had been through layoffs before. Termination was bad but survivable. I had skills, experience, a good resume. I would find another job. I did not expect what actually happened. 48 hours later, I received an email from HR with Frank copied. The subject line read, Organizational restructuring. My hands trembled as I opened it. I was being restructured from Director of Compliance to Junior Compliance Intern, effective immediately. My annual salary of $95,000 was being reduced to $12 per hour, minimum wage in Texas. My corner office was being reassigned. My direct reports, 3 junior compliance specialists I had hired and trained myself, were being transferred to report directly to Frank. I would now report to Frank as well, working from a cubicle near the mailroom. The email claimed this restructuring was due to performance concerns and recent errors in judgment regarding compliance protocols. It said that after careful review, leadership had determined I needed additional training and supervision before I could be trusted with director-level responsibilities. It was corporate language designed to destroy me professionally while protecting the company legally. The humiliation was immediate and brutally public. I had to pack up my corner office while colleagues walked past, whispering, staring. 7 years of work, awards, certificates, personal items, all shoved into cardboard boxes, while people I had worked alongside for years suddenly could not make eye contact. My new cubicle was in the least desirable part of the office, a 5-foot by 5-foot space with fabric walls that did not even reach the ceiling. The chair was broken, one wheel missing. The overhead fluorescent light flickered constantly. There was no window, no privacy, no dignity. Frank assigned me tasks that had nothing to do with compliance and everything to do with humiliation. I filed old paperwork in the storage room. I organized supply closets. I made copies of documents that could have been emailed. I delivered inter-office mail. I was a highly qualified compliance professional with 7 years of specialized experience being treated like I did not know how to use a stapler. The weekly all-staff meeting that Friday was the worst. Frank stood at the front of the conference room and announced my new role with barely concealed glee. He made jokes about me earning my way back up and learning from the ground floor. He said sometimes people need to be humbled to remember what really matters. People laughed nervously. Some looked uncomfortable. Most just looked relieved it was not them. Two of my former team members, Brandon and Taylor, looked devastated but said nothing. Everyone was scared. If Frank could do this to me, he could do it to anyone. Over the next 10 days, Frank systematically dismantled everything I had built. He removed my access to all compliance databases and monitoring systems. He excluded me from every meeting related to compliance, audit, or regulatory matters. He circulated a memo to the leadership team claiming I had made critical errors that nearly cost the company its certifications. None of it was true. Every certification we held, I had earned through meticulous work. But Frank was rewriting history, positioning himself as the compliance expert who had saved the company from my incompetence. I tried to defend myself. I scheduled a meeting with Patricia Holmes, our HR director. Patricia had always seemed fair, professional. I walked into her office with documentation showing my years of excellent performance reviews, the certifications I had obtained for the company, the recognition I had received from industry organizations. Patricia barely looked at it. She said the decision to restructure my position came from the executive level and was final. She said if I had concerns about my performance evaluation, I could submit a formal written rebuttal, but it would not change the outcome. She suggested I focus on learning and improving rather than dwelling on the past. I realized then that Patricia was either complicit or powerless. Either way, she was not going to help me. Frank had positioned himself too well. He controlled the narrative. Anyone who might have defended me was too afraid to speak up. I was alone. On my 10th day as an intern, Frank called me into his office. I sat in the same chair where I had presented my findings about the HIPAA violations less than 2 weeks earlier. Everything had changed. Frank leaned forward, elbows on his desk, and spoke in a tone that was almost friendly. He said he wanted to help me understand my situation clearly. He said he had friends at every major tech company in the region. He served on the board of the National Compliance Association. He knew hiring managers at regulatory consulting firms, at healthcare companies, at software startups. He had built a network over 25 years in the industry. He picked up his phone and showed me draft emails ready to send. Each one was addressed to a different hiring manager or recruiter. Each one described me as unstable, insubordinate, and potentially fraudulent in my compliance work. Each one suggested that any company considering hiring me should think very carefully about the risks. He had not sent them yet, he said. He was giving me options. Option 1. I could quietly resign. I would sign a non-disparagement agreement, promising never to speak negatively about DataCore or anyone who worked there. I would agree not to contact any regulatory agencies with concerns. In exchange, Frank would stay silent. He would not send the emails. He would not actively sabotage my job search. I would be free to leave and try to rebuild my career, though he could not promise anyone would hire me after such a sudden resignation from a director position. Option 2. I could fight back. I could file complaints with HR. I could contact federal regulators about my imaginary concerns. I could try to make trouble. If I chose that path, Frank would destroy me. He would send every email. He would make sure everyone in the compliance community knew I was untrustworthy. He would ensure I never worked in compliance again, never worked in tech again, never worked in any professional capacity again. I would be blacklisted so thoroughly that I would be lucky to get a job waiting tables. He gave me the weekend to decide. I walked out of his office feeling like the walls were closing in. I had no good options. If I resigned and stayed silent, Frank got away with everything. The HIPAA violations would continue. Patient data would remain at risk. The acquisition would go through based on fraudulent compliance certifications. Frank would profit enormously while I slunk away defeated. But if I fought back, I would lose everything. Frank had power, connections, and zero ethics. I had the truth, but truth alone does not pay rent. That weekend was the longest of my life. I barely slept. I sat at my kitchen table reviewing my documentation of the HIPAA violations over and over, as if staring at the evidence would somehow reveal a solution I had missed. My partner Dylan, a high school English teacher with the patience of a saint, brought me tea and tried to comfort me. He said my health mattered more than exposing one corrupt boss. He said I could find another job, another company, another path. He said I had already sacrificed enough. Dylan was probably right. The logical choice was to resign quietly, sign whatever Frank wanted, and move on. But every time I thought about doing that, I felt physically sick. I kept thinking about the patients whose data was sitting on those offshore servers. Real people with cancer diagnoses, HIV status, mental health records, addiction treatment histories. Their most private information was vulnerable because Frank prioritized profit over protection. And I was the only person who knew and had proof. If I stayed silent, who would protect them? I also could not stomach the idea of Frank taking credit for 7 years of my work. He would tell the acquisition company that he built the compliance program. He would probably get promoted, get a huge payout when the deal closed, be celebrated as an innovator. Meanwhile, I would be erased, humiliated, maybe destroyed professionally. The injustice of it burned. On Monday morning, I made my decision. I dressed in professional clothes for the first time in 2 weeks, not because I had to, but because I wanted to. I drove to the office, walked past my sad little cubicle, and went straight to HR. Patricia was at her desk. I placed my badge and building access card on her desk and told her I was resigning effective immediately. Patricia asked if I wanted to discuss it. I said there was nothing to discuss. She pulled out papers Frank had already prepared, a resignation letter and a non-disparagement agreement. I read them both carefully. I signed the resignation letter. I refused to sign the non-disparagement agreement. Patricia looked uncomfortable. She said the agreement was standard, that it protected both me and the company. I said I would not sign anything that prevented me from speaking truthfully if asked direct questions. I would not commit perjury or obstruct any future investigation. Patricia said there was no investigation. I said not yet. I walked out. I went to my cubicle and packed the few personal items I had brought. My hands shook as I put my favorite coffee mug, a photo of Dylan and me on vacation, and a small plant into a cardboard box. I had given 7 years to this company. I had built something I was proud of, and it all ended in a flickering cubicle near the mailroom. Frank found me as I was leaving. He was holding a cup of coffee, looking relaxed and victorious. He asked mockingly if I was giving up already. I told him I was resigning, but I was not staying silent about the compliance violations. He laughed in my face. He said I had no proof anyone would believe. He said any documentation I had was company property, and if I tried to use it, he would sue me for theft of trade secrets. He said I had just committed career suicide, and he would make sure everyone knew it. He repeated those words from earlier. No one will hire you now. I walked out with my box of personal items, head high despite my shaking hands. I knew I might have just destroyed my own career, but I refused to be complicit in his fraud. Within 3 days, reality hit hard. Dylan and I lived in a decent 2-bedroom apartment in South Austin, costing $1,800 a month. My car payment was $400. Student loans were $350. We had utilities, groceries, insurance. I had some savings, maybe $8,000, which would cover about 3 months of basic expenses if we were careful. After that, financial catastrophe. I started applying for compliance positions immediately. I was qualified. I was experienced. I had built an award-winning program. I should have been getting interviews within days, and I did get initial interest. Recruiters looked at my resume and reached out. But then something strange happened. After I provided references or named my previous employer, the conversations died. Emails went unanswered. Scheduled phone interviews were mysteriously canceled. Positions were suddenly filled. One recruiter I had worked with before, a woman named Angela, who had placed me in 2 previous jobs, called me personally. She said she needed to tell me something off the record. Someone was spreading concerning information about me in the industry. She would not say who, but hiring managers were being told I had been terminated for falsifying compliance documentation and that I was under investigation for ethical violations. The rumors were vague enough to avoid legal liability, but damaging enough to make me untouchable. Angela said she believed me when I said it was not true, but she could not help me. Her reputation was on the line, too. She wished me luck and said to call her in a year when things might have died down. A year. I had 3 months of savings. 2 weeks after resigning, I discovered the full extent of Frank's sabotage. He had contacted the National Compliance Association, where he served on the board of directors. He filed a formal complaint, claiming I had falsified compliance documentation at DataCore Systems. The association launched what they called a preliminary ethics inquiry. They sent me a letter asking me to respond to allegations of professional misconduct. The letter was copied to every member company. My profile on their website, which had previously showcased my speaking engagements and certifications, was flagged with a notice that I was under ethical review. The inquiry itself might eventually clear me, but the damage was immediate. Every compliance professional in the country could see that flag. Every company that checked my background would see it. Frank had weaponized my professional association against me. He had also reached out to colleagues at other firms, leaving carefully worded messages that questioned my judgment and integrity without making specific false claims that could be proven as defamation. He was too smart to leave a clear trail. I was not just unemployed. I was unemployable. My entire profession had been poisoned against me. I broke down crying in my car after my 5th rejection that day. Dylan suggested maybe I should consider leaving compliance entirely, perhaps teaching or getting into a different field. The thought of abandoning my career felt like Frank winning completely. But what choice did I have? As the weeks passed with no job prospects, the strain on my relationship with Dylan became unbearable. He was supportive and loving, but he was also worried. His teacher salary was $52,000 a year, decent but not enough to cover all our expenses long term. We had always split costs. Now he was covering more and more. He never complained, but I felt like a burden. I felt like a failure. I started snapping at him over small things. He left dishes in the sink, and I acted like it was a catastrophe. He suggested we watch a movie, and I accused him of not taking our financial situation seriously. He asked how my job search was going, and I shut down completely. I could not sleep. I stopped taking care of myself. I wore the same clothes for days. I stopped going to the gym, stopped seeing friends, stopped doing anything that cost money or required me to pretend I was okay. Dylan tried to be patient. One night he sat me down and gently suggested I talk to someone, maybe see a therapist. I laughed bitterly. Therapy cost $150 an hour without insurance, and I no longer had insurance. He offered to pay for it. That made me cry harder. He was already covering my share of rent. The thought of him paying for therapy because I could not handle my life was humiliating. We had a painful argument about a week later. Dylan said I was obsessing over Frank and the HIPAA violations. He said I needed to let it go for my own mental health. He said I had done what I could, and now I needed to focus on moving forward. I exploded. I said he did not understand what it felt like to have your entire career destroyed by a corrupt man with no consequences. I said he did not understand what it meant to know patient data was at risk and be powerless to stop it. I said a lot of things I should not have said. Dylan took it. He apologized for not understanding. He said he just wanted me to be okay. We made up, but the damage lingered. I could feel the distance growing between us. My failure was infecting the one good thing I had left. After depleting most of my savings, I had to face reality. I took a part-time job at a clothing retail store in a strip mall. $12 an hour, 20 to 30 hours a week, whatever shifts they had available. I folded shirts, organized racks, ran the register, smiled at customers while dying inside. It was humiliating after being a director. After 7 years of professional expertise, after building something important, now I was asking people if they needed help finding their size. I worked evening and weekend shifts, which meant I could still apply for professional jobs during the day. Not that it mattered. No one was calling. But I kept applying anyway, because the alternative was admitting defeat. One afternoon, I received an email from Brandon, one of my former team members at DataCore. He used his personal email address, not his work one. The subject line said, "You should know." Inside, he wrote that things had gotten worse since I left. Frank was cutting corners everywhere, pushing aggressive timelines to close the acquisition. He had hired his nephew, a 23-year-old with an undergraduate degree in marketing, as the new compliance director. The nephew had no compliance experience, no certifications, no idea what he was doing. Frank was feeding him exactly what to say and do. Brandon said the HIPAA violations were still happening, maybe getting worse, but everyone was too scared to speak up. Frank had made an example of me. The message was clear. Challenge Frank, and your career is over. Brandon had a mortgage and 2 young kids. He could not afford to be the next target. He was looking for other jobs quietly, but he could not go on record about any of this. He felt terrible about it. He hoped I understood. I understood. I did not blame Brandon. He had a family to protect, but it made me feel even more isolated. I was the only person willing to take the risk, and I had lost everything for it. Meanwhile, Frank was winning. 6 weeks after my resignation, I was scrolling through business news on my phone during my lunch break at the retail store. An article caught my eye. MedTech giant Horizon Health Solutions announces intent to acquire DataCore Systems for $30 million. I felt physically ill. The deal was expected to close within 60 days, pending due diligence and regulatory approvals. The article quoted Frank Donovan praising DataCore's industry-leading compliance infrastructure that made them an attractive acquisition target. Industry-leading compliance infrastructure. My work. My 7 years. And Frank was taking credit for all of it, while I folded clearance rack t-shirts for minimum wage. The article mentioned that Horizon Health Solutions was a major healthcare technology company with operations in 38 states, serving over 2 million patients. If they acquired DataCore without discovering the HIPAA violations, they would inherit massive liability. Worse, patient data would remain at risk. The violations might spread into Horizon's systems. The potential harm was enormous. I could not let this happen. I knew I should probably stay out of it, protect myself, focus on rebuilding my own life. But I kept thinking about those 2 million patients. I kept thinking about the healthcare data sitting on unauthorized offshore servers where it could be accessed, stolen, sold to the highest bidder. I kept thinking about people whose most private medical information was vulnerable because Frank cared more about money than morals. I made a decision that probably was not rational or smart, but it felt necessary. I created a new anonymous email account using a VPN service to mask my location. I compiled all my documentation of the HIPAA violations, the server logs, the API access records, the email chains showing Frank's approvals, the policy violations, everything. I organized it clearly, professionally, with explanatory notes, so someone without deep technical knowledge could understand what they were looking at. I addressed the email to the General Counsel of Horizon Health Solutions. I found his name, Gregory Armstrong, on the company website. I wrote a brief message explaining that I was sending this information anonymously because I believed Horizon needed to be aware of serious compliance issues at DataCore before finalizing the acquisition. I did not identify myself. I did not explain how I obtained the documentation. I just said the information was accurate and verifiable, and that patient data was at risk. I sat in a coffee shop near my apartment, double-checking everything one more time. My finger hovered over the send button. If they traced this back to me, Frank would sue me into oblivion. He would claim I stole trade secrets, that I violated confidentiality agreements, that I was sabotaging the acquisition out of spite. I could face criminal charges, but if I did not send it, the acquisition would go through. Frank would win. Patients would remain at risk. I hit send. The email went out into the void. I immediately closed my laptop, and felt my heart racing. What had I done? There was no taking it back. I had just committed an act that could destroy what little I had left. I drove home in a panic, convinced I had made a terrible mistake. Dylan asked if I was okay. I lied and said yes. I could not tell him what I had done. He would think I was self-destructive. Maybe I was. 1 week after I sent that anonymous email, I was at the retail store reorganizing the denim section when my phone buzzed with a news alert. Horizon Health Solutions pauses data core acquisition pending compliance review. My hands froze on a pair of jeans. I pulled out my phone and read the full article. Horizon had announced they were extending their due diligence period to conduct an additional review of DataCore's compliance practices. The statement said they had identified potential regulatory concerns, requiring thorough investigation before proceeding with the transaction. My heart hammered in my chest. They had taken my documentation seriously. They were investigating. The article included quotes from both companies. Horizon's spokesperson said they were committed to the highest standards of patient data protection and would not finalize any acquisition until they were fully satisfied with compliance standards. Frank Donovan was quoted saying he was confident all compliance matters would be resolved quickly and that DataCore welcomed any scrutiny of their industry-leading programs. Industry-leading programs I built. While I folded jeans for $12 an hour. But at least the truth was coming out. At least someone was looking at the violations. I felt a spark of hope for the first time in weeks. Maybe this would lead to justice. Maybe my sacrifice meant something. Maybe Frank would finally face consequences. What I did not know was that Frank immediately suspected me. The anonymous email contained specific technical details that only someone with deep system access would know. He narrowed his suspect list down to 3 people: me, Brandon, or Taylor. He hired a private cybersecurity firm to attempt to trace the email. They could not definitively identify the sender because I had used a VPN, but they did discover that the email had been sent from an IP address associated with a coffee shop in South Austin, less than 2 miles from my apartment. Frank convinced himself it was me. He probably was not wrong. He decided that pausing the acquisition was not enough punishment. He wanted to destroy me completely, permanently, so thoroughly that I would never be able to recover. He contacted a law firm that specialized in corporate litigation and had them draft a lawsuit against me personally. The lawsuit named me as the defendant and listed 3 causes of action: theft of trade secrets, breach of fiduciary duty, and tortious interference with business relations. The complaint alleged that I had stolen confidential company information after my resignation, retained proprietary data without authorization, and deliberately sabotaged DataCore's acquisition by spreading false and misleading information to the potential buyer. It sought $500,000 in compensatory damages, plus punitive damages, and attorney fees. $500,000. I did not have $500. I was working retail, making maybe $900 a month. The lawsuit was designed to terrify me into submission, and it worked. I was at the store folding clearance shirts when a man in a suit approached me. I thought he was a customer at first. He asked if I was Cassandra. I said yes. He handed me a manila envelope and said I had been served. He walked away. My coworkers stared at me. Customers stared at me. I stood there in the middle of the store, holding legal papers, hands shaking, feeling like the floor was dropping out from under me. I went to the bathroom and read the complaint. Every allegation was a lie or a distortion. I had not stolen anything. The documentation I compiled was created during my employment, using information I had legal access to. I had not breached any fiduciary duty because I had no duty to help Frank commit fraud. I had not tortiously interfered with the acquisition. I had provided truthful information about regulatory violations. But defending against these claims would require lawyers, depositions, court filings, maybe a trial. It would cost tens of thousands of dollars I did not have. I called 3 attorneys that afternoon. The first specialized in employment law and said this was outside his expertise. The second listened to my story and said I had good defenses, but he would need a $25,000 retainer to take the case. I told him I was working retail. He wished me luck. The third attorney was more sympathetic. She said I could try to represent myself, that the court would provide some assistance to pro se litigants. But she was honest about my chances. Frank had expensive lawyers. I had no legal training. Even if I was right on the law, I could still lose on procedure, on technicalities, on simple inexperience. She recommended I try to settle, maybe agree to destroy my documentation, and sign a more restrictive confidentiality agreement in exchange for Frank dropping the suit. Settle. Give Frank everything he wanted. Admit defeat. It made me sick, but what choice did I have? I could not afford to defend myself. If I ignored the lawsuit, Frank would win by default judgment. He could garnish my wages, put liens on anything I owned, follow me for the rest of my life collecting on a $500,000 judgment. Dylan was furious when I told him. Not at me, at Frank. He wanted to drive to Datacorp and confront Frank himself. I had to talk him down. He suggested we move, leave Texas entirely, start over somewhere. Frank could not find us. Run away. The thought was tempting but impossible. Running would not make the lawsuit disappear. And what about my career? What about doing the right thing? Was I just supposed to let Frank win? I barely slept that night. I kept thinking in circles, trying to find a solution that did not exist. I had 3 days to file a response to the lawsuit or risk default. I had no money for a lawyer. I had no good options. I felt trapped in every possible way. Then, 3 days after being served with Frank's lawsuit, I received another official-looking envelope in the mail. This one was from a law firm in Dallas, Armstrong & Associates. Inside was a subpoena. Horizon Health Solutions was conducting formal discovery related to their acquisition due diligence of Datacorp systems. They wanted me to appear for a deposition regarding compliance practices and documentation at Datacorp. The deposition was scheduled for the following week, at their law offices in downtown Austin. They knew who I was. They knew I had been compliance director. They had figured out I was the anonymous source, or at least a key witness. This was either my chance to tell the truth publicly, under oath, with potential legal protection, or it was Frank's trap to get me to incriminate myself in his lawsuit. I had no attorney to advise me on which it was, or what I should do. The subpoena was not optional. If I did not show up, I could be held in contempt of court. But if I did show up and testified about the HIPAA violations, I would be essentially admitting I sent the anonymous email that would give Frank all the ammunition he needed to prove his lawsuit claims. I would be confirming I had company documentation and used it to interfere with the acquisition. I had 5 days to decide whether to show up or run. 5 days to figure out if this was my salvation or my destruction. Those 5 days felt like 5 years. I could not eat. I could not sleep. I researched what to expect in a deposition, watching YouTube videos, and reading legal guides meant for attorneys. I reviewed all my documentation again, making sure I understood every detail in case I was questioned. I knew I had the truth on my side. I knew patient data was genuinely at risk. I knew Frank had committed real violations and then tried to destroy me for refusing to cover them up. But I also knew truth did not always win in legal battles. Money won, power won, and Frank had both. Dylan held me while I cried the night before the deposition. He said whatever I decided, he supported me completely. If I wanted to show up and fight, he would be there. If I wanted to ignore the subpoena and face contempt charges, he would figure it out with me. If I wanted to leave the state and start over, he would pack tonight. He just wanted me to do whatever would let me live with myself. That was the question, was it not? What could I live with? I had already lost my career, my savings, my professional reputation. I was facing a lawsuit I could not afford to defend. My relationship was strained. My mental health was hanging by a thread. What did I have left to lose? My integrity, I guess. My self-respect. The knowledge that I tried to do the right thing, even when it cost me everything. I decided to show up. I decided to tell the truth. If my career was already destroyed, At least I could make sure the truth came out. At least Frank's fraud would be exposed. At least patient data might be protected. That had to be worth something. The law office was on the 32nd floor of a downtown Austin high-rise, all glass and steel and expensive furniture. I wore my only professional suit, which was wrinkled from hanging in the closet for months. I felt small and shabby, walking into that reception area, with its marble floors and modern art. A paralegal escorted me to a conference room with a table that could seat 20 people. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the city. I could see the Texas State Capitol building in the distance. Already in the room were a court reporter setting up her equipment, and 3 attorneys I did not recognize. A large video screen on the wall showed a conference room at another location where Frank Donovan and his attorney Saturday. Frank looked calm, confident, wearing a suit that probably cost more than my monthly rent used to be. His attorney was a sharp-looking woman in her 40s, with a reputation for aggressive litigation. I recognized her name from the lawsuit papers. I sat alone on one side of the long table. No attorney beside me. No one to object if questions were improper, or advise me when to answer. Just me, a glass of water, and the truth. The lead attorney for Horizon introduced himself as Gregory Armstrong, senior counsel. He was maybe 60 years old, gray hair, kind eyes, a voice that was firm but not unkind. He explained that they were investigating compliance matters at DataCore before finalizing the acquisition. My testimony would be under oath and recorded. Everything I said could be used in legal proceedings. He asked if I understood. I said yes. The court reporter swore me in. I raised my right hand and swore to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. Armstrong started with basic questions. My name, address, employment history. When did I start at DataCore? What were my responsibilities? What qualifications did I have? I answered clearly, professionally, trying to keep my voice steady. I explained that I had a master's degree in health administration, multiple compliance certifications, and 7 years of experience building DataCore's compliance program from scratch. Armstrong asked me to describe the compliance system I built. I did, in detail. The policies and procedures, the monitoring systems, the training programs, the audit processes. I explained how we achieved HIPAA certification, how we maintained it, how we demonstrated compliance to clients and regulators. Armstrong took notes. The court reporter's fingers flew across her machine. Frank watched me from the video screen, his expression unreadable. Then Armstrong asked about the quarterly compliance reports. Who prepared them? Who reviewed them? Who signed off on them? I explained that I prepared them based on my audits, reviewed them with Frank as my supervisor, and then submitted them to the board of directors. Armstrong asked if the most recent quarterly report had been accurate. I hesitated. This was the moment. Once I answered this question honestly, there was no going back. I glanced at Frank's face on the screen. His eyes were cold, threatening, daring me to do it. I looked back at Armstrong. I took a breath. I told the truth. I said the most recent quarterly report had not been submitted because I refused to certify it as accurate. I said I had discovered serious HIPAA violations during my audit. I said Frank had ordered me to ignore the violations and sign off on a clean report. I said I refused. The room went absolutely silent. You could have heard a pin drop. Armstrong leaned forward slightly. He asked me to explain exactly what violations I had discovered. I did. I walked through the unauthorized data routing, the offshore servers, the lack of client consent, the potential exposure of patient information. I explained that Frank had personally approved the back-end changes that created the violations. I explained that the violations had been ongoing for months, maybe longer. Frank's attorney interrupted via video, her voice sharp. She said I was making serious allegations without evidence. She said this sounded like retaliation from a disgruntled former employee. Armstrong ignored her. He slid a folder across the table to me. Inside were printouts of server logs, email chains, system configurations, my documentation, the information I had sent anonymously. Armstrong asked if I could verify the authenticity of these documents. I looked through them slowly. They were real. Everything I had compiled was right there in that folder. I said yes. These documents were authentic. Armstrong asked how I could be certain. This was it. The moment I had been dreading and somehow hoping for. I paused, took a breath, and admitted the truth. I said I was certain because I had created this documentation. I had compiled it when I discovered the violations. And I had sent it anonymously to Horizon Health Solutions because I knew patient data was at risk and no one else was going to protect it. Frank's attorney practically shouted through the video connection. She said I had just admitted to theft of trade secrets. She said this confession would be used against me in Frank's lawsuit. She said I had just destroyed any defense I might have had. Armstrong held up a hand and calmly told her this was his deposition, and she could raise objections through proper channels later. He turned back to me. For the next hour, he asked me to walk through every violation in excruciating detail. Every unauthorized server, every data flow, every email from Frank, every conversation where he ordered me to falsify reports. I held nothing back. I explained how Frank had demoted me to intern when I refused to comply. I explained the humiliation, the blacklisting, the threats. I explained how he had systematically destroyed my career for doing my job. I explained that I sent the documentation to Horizon because patient safety mattered more than my own self-preservation. My voice cracked several times. My hands shook. But I told the complete truth, every painful detail. When I finished, I felt exhausted and strangely relieved. It was out. All of it. Whatever happened next, at least the truth was on the record. After I finished my testimony, Gregory Armstrong leaned back in his chair and was quiet for a long moment. He looked at his colleagues, then back at me. He said he needed to tell me something. Over the past 2 weeks, Horizon's due diligence team had conducted an independent investigation of DataCore's compliance practices. They had hired forensic auditors. They had interviewed current employees confidentially, promising protection from retaliation. They had analyzed system logs and data flows. They had compared DataCore's actual practices to what had been represented in the acquisition materials. Everything I had just testified to under oath matched what they had found independently. The HIPAA violations were real. The unauthorized data routing was real. Frank's personal approval of the problematic changes was documented in multiple places. More than that, they had discovered Frank had deliberately concealed these issues during due diligence, providing false certifications of compliance while knowing they were untrue. He had also falsely claimed credit for building the compliance infrastructure that made DataCore attractive as an acquisition target in the first place. Armstrong looked at me with something that might have been respect. He said those exact words I had been waiting to hear without knowing I was waiting for them. He asked if I was the same Cassandra who had built DataCore's compliance system from scratch. I nodded, not trusting my voice. He smiled, actually smiled, and said Horizon Health Solutions would like me to lead their compliance division. They needed someone with my integrity and expertise, someone who would do the right thing, even when it cost them everything. Someone who put patient safety above career advancement or personal gain. I stared at him. A job offer? Now? After everything? I must have looked shocked because Armstrong continued. He said Horizon was a $30 billion company with operations across the country. Their compliance division oversaw programs for all their subsidiaries, affecting over 2 million patients and 6,000 employees. It was a massive responsibility. They needed someone extraordinary, someone who had proven they could not be bought, threatened, or intimidated into compromising patient safety. But there was one condition. The condition was that I testify as an expert witness in the federal investigation Horizon would be initiating against Frank Donovan and DataCore Systems. The Department of Health and Human Services would be involved. Possibly the FBI, given the evidence of deliberate fraud in connection with the acquisition. I would need to provide testimony, documentation, and expert analysis. I would need to face Frank in legal proceedings that could last months or years. Was I willing to do that? I almost laughed. Was I willing? I had already lost everything fighting Frank. Now someone was offering me a chance to finish what I started, with legal protection and resources? I said yes before Armstrong even finished explaining. He slid another folder across the table. A formal offer letter, Director of Compliance, Horizon Health Solutions Technology Division. Salary, $145,000 annually. Full benefits including health, dental, vision, retirement match, signing bonus of $30,000 to help with my legal bills and lost income during unemployment. Start date, as soon as I was ready, but they hoped within 30 days. I would lead a team of 20 compliance professionals across multiple states. I would have the budget, authority, and executive support to build programs the right way. No corners cut, no compromises. Just excellent, ethical compliance work protecting patient data. The salary was almost $50,000 more than I had made at DataCore. The signing bonus alone would wipe out my debts and rebuild my savings. I would be doing what I loved, what I was good at, for a company that valued integrity over profit. I started crying right there at the conference table. 7 years of work, months of unemployment and humiliation, the fear and isolation and financial terror, all of it came pouring out. Armstrong politely looked away while I composed myself. He pushed a box of tissues across the table. I asked about Frank's lawsuit against me. Armstrong said Horizon's legal team would defend me pro bono as part of my employment. They would countersue Frank for malicious prosecution and abuse of process. With the evidence they now had of his fraud, his lawsuit against me would be dismissed quickly, probably with sanctions against him for filing a frivolous claim meant to silence a whistleblower. I would not pay a single dollar in legal fees. In fact, I would probably recover damages from Frank for what he put me through. I asked about my professional reputation, the ethics inquiry, the blacklisting. Armstrong said Horizon had significant influence in the industry. They would make it publicly clear that I was a whistleblower who acted with courage and integrity. They would work with the National Compliance Association to not only clear my name, but recognize my actions. Frank, on the other hand, would be finished. The compliance community would know he was a fraud who stole credit for work he did not do, and then tried to destroy the person who actually did it. I asked when I could start. Armstrong said they would handle all the logistics. They would help me relocate to Dallas if I wanted, or I could work remotely from Austin. They would provide whatever support I needed to transition. But first, they wanted me to rest, to recover, to take care of myself. I had been through trauma. They wanted their new director of compliance to start strong, healthy, and ready to build something excellent. I accepted the position right there. I signed the offer letter with shaking hands. When I walked out of that conference room, I felt lighter than I had in months. The sky looked bluer. The air felt cleaner. I drove home and told Dylan everything. He picked me up and spun me around in our tiny apartment kitchen. We ordered takeout and celebrated. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt hope. The next few weeks moved quickly. Frank's lawsuit against me was dismissed with prejudice, meaning he could never refile it. The judge issued sanctions, ordering Frank to pay $15,000 to cover my legal expenses, even though I had not hired an attorney. Horizon's lawyers filed counterclaims on my behalf. Frank was facing multiple federal investigations. The Department of Health and Human Services launched a formal inquiry into the HIPAA violations. The Securities and Exchange Commission opened an investigation into whether Frank had committed fraud in connection with the acquisition attempt. DataCore's board of directors forced Frank to resign. They were facing their own liability for failing to properly oversee compliance. The acquisition was terminated completely. Horizon walked away. DataCore's valuation collapsed. Investors filed lawsuits against Frank personally for misrepresenting the company's compliance status. His professional reputation was destroyed. The National Compliance Association removed him from the board and opened their own ethics investigation against him. He was facing potential criminal charges that could result in prison time. Everything Frank had done to me was happening to him, magnified 100 times. The industry learned the truth. He was a fraud who had stolen credit for my work, committed serious regulatory violations, and then tried to destroy me for refusing to help him cover it up. His career was over. His legacy was ruined. He would spend years in legal battles and might end up in federal prison. Meanwhile, my life transformed completely. 6 months after that deposition, I sat in my new corner office at Horizon Health Solutions in Dallas, overlooking the city skyline. The office was beautiful, but more importantly, it was filled with purpose. I led a team of brilliant compliance professionals who respected my expertise and valued integrity. We were building programs that actually protected patient data, not just checked regulatory boxes. We had executive support, proper funding, and the freedom to do things right. My relationship with Dylan was stronger than ever. The stress and fear that had nearly torn us apart was replaced by pride and partnership. He moved to Dallas with me and found a teaching position at a great school. We found a nice apartment, bigger than our old place, with a view of a park. We adopted a dog. We talked about getting married. Life felt stable, hopeful, full of possibility. The financial stress was gone. The $30,000 signing bonus covered all my debts with money left over. My salary meant we could save, travel, plan for a future. I no longer checked my bank account with dread every morning. I no longer had anxiety attacks about bills. Money was not everything, but not having to worry about it created space for happiness. My professional reputation was not just restored, but enhanced. I was asked to speak at conferences about whistleblower protection and ethical compliance. I wrote articles for industry publications about building cultures of integrity. The National Compliance Association gave me an award for courage in protecting patient safety. Other compliance professionals reached out to say my story inspired them to speak up about issues at their own companies. I had become, accidentally, a symbol of doing the right thing, even when it costs everything. I testified in the federal cases against Frank. It was difficult reliving everything, but I did it because it mattered. Because patient data deserved protection. Because fraud should have consequences. Because people who abuse power should not win. The legal process was ongoing, but the outcome seemed certain. Frank would face substantial penalties, possibly prison time. Justice was slow, but it was coming. Looking back on everything, I realized something important. Doing the right thing often costs everything in the short term. The path of integrity can lead through humiliation, isolation, financial terror, and crushing fear. There were moments when I thought I had destroyed my life for nothing. Moments when staying silent and protecting myself seemed like the only rational choice. But truth has a way of surfacing. Courage means acting even when you cannot see the outcome, even when every logical calculation says you will lose. I learned that my worth was never defined by one corrupt boss, or one company, or one position. Real professional value comes from expertise, ethics, and the willingness to stand firm when it matters most. You can lose your job, your savings, your reputation, and still not lose yourself. Sometimes you have to lose everything to gain what truly matters. Self-respect, purpose, and proof that justice can prevail. The system does not always work. Truth does not always win. But sometimes, if you hold on long enough, if you refuse to be silenced, if you do the right thing, even when it costs you everything, things can turn around. Not because the universe is fair, but because there are still people and institutions that value integrity, because whistleblowers matter, because patient safety matters, because someone, somewhere, might be paying attention and willing to act. I will never get back the months I lost to fear and unemployment. I will never forget the humiliation of being demoted to intern after 7 years of excellent work. I will never stop feeling angry about what Frank tried to do to me. But I also will never regret refusing to falsify that compliance report. I will never regret sending that anonymous email. I will never regret showing up to that deposition and telling the truth. Those were the moments that defined who I am. Those were the moments that made everything after possible. If you are facing something similar, if someone is asking you to compromise your ethics, if you are being punished for doing the right thing, I want you to know you are not alone. It is terrifying. It is unfair. It might cost you more than you think you can afford to lose. But your integrity is worth protecting. The truth matters. And sometimes, just sometimes, courage leads to justice. Now, I want to ask you something. Have you ever faced a situation where doing the right thing meant risking everything you worked for? Have you ever had to choose between your career and your conscience? Share your story in the comments below. I would love to hear how you navigated those impossible choices. And if this story resonated with you, if it gave you hope or made you think differently about standing up for what is right, please hit that like button. Subscribe to this channel for more stories about everyday people facing extraordinary challenges and finding the courage to overcome them. Share this video with anyone who might need to hear that integrity matters, that whistleblowers deserve protection, and that justice, though slow, can still prevail. Thank you for listening to my story. Thank you for caring about compliance, about patient safety, about holding powerful people accountable. Thank you for believing that one person standing up can make a difference. I hope your own journey, whatever challenges you face, leads you to a place of peace, purpose, and triumph. Take care of yourselves, and never stop fighting for what is right.